then you probably have to consent to the recording from wherever you are. So thanks for doing that. All right, thanks everyone for being with us tonight. Really appreciate your being part of the Wednesday night series. We had a fantastic week last week where we started off thinking about and reflecting on the dark night of the soul. This week we're going into queering our faith. Really looking forward to tonight's panel, and next week thinking about engaging the disabled God, and then the week after talking about decolonizing. So thanks if you can make some of the others and want to tune in. We'd appreciate having you there. But just grateful you're here tonight. I don't know about you. I just have more energy today. It's been one of the nicer days that we've had in a while. As something feels like it's actually breaking forth. I have a similar sense for tonight. Something's breaking forth. I don't know if any of you watch or listen to Evan Dawson Connections, but every day Evan Dawson says, well, this connection was made, blah, 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 and he starts talking. And so actually tonight's connection was made. Lauren and I were catching up last year sometime or maybe before, and we had just really had a great and exciting conversation about this idea of queering our faith, and really wanted to do more with this. And so whatever we end up talking about tonight, the hope is that this is the beginning of a conversation, an ongoing conversation. It's obviously a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and we're picking up a piece of it, doing some of that tonight, and then kind of maybe seeing where this goes in our community or in the wider community. And so really grateful to Lauren for being the point person, and also to all of the panelists who are joining us tonight, and being willing to offer reflections, and then all of you to hear your reflections, your thoughts, what it affirms for you, what it might challenge for you, and where it might take our spiritual lives, and where it might take our faith in a deeper process. So thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to take us through the rest of the evening.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thank you so much first to the panelists, 3 people whom I really admire. And I sent this in an email. They all have really unique, brilliant minds. So I'm so excited that they're going to be sharing with us. So my name is Lauren Irzetta Fry. I do work at Spiritus. I'm one of the youth pastors. My wife is here listening, and we're expecting our first child in less than a month. So super excited, yes, about that. But I'm so excited to see so many people on here. And again, tonight is all about being open, asking questions. Like I said, our panel is incredible, and a lot of knowledge to be shared. So I'm going to get us started off with an opening prayer, just to open our hearts and our minds, and a little background about sort of continuing on with what Mike was saying. So if you're feeling comfortable and you want to close your eyes and sort of just get yourself in a position that sort of opens up your mind and heart. O cosmic birther of all radiance and vibration, soften the ground of our being and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be empowered to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with your desire. Endow us with the wisdom to produce and share what each being needs to grow and flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us as we release others from the entanglement of past mistakes. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose, but illuminate the opportunities of the present moment. For you are the ground and the fruitful vision, the birth power and fulfillment, as all is gathered and made whole once again. Amen. That is sort of just a rendition of the Our Father, like taking the words and changing it a little bit, and sort of an example of what we're going to be doing tonight. And talking about tonight. Our 3 panelists, again, we are going to bring ideas to you that may be a little bit different from what you might have sort of heard before, or our own ideas might be a little bit different. And again, that's the whole point. So when we're talking about queering our faith, We're really looking at applied to look for places where things such as gender, sexuality, masculinity, and femininity can be challenged and questioned. So looking at the Bible as a living document, looking at the people we interact with, and looking at the people in the Bible, and sort of looking at them in different venues. So questioning is sort of really what we're looking at tonight. We're gonna hear from our different panelists and then hopefully end with a rich conversation. Some questions that I'm gonna put to all of you to think about while we're going through this is, like, what does this mean for your life, right? So what does this conversation mean for your life? What can you open up and maybe invite, maybe a new practice or idea? What does it challenge, right? So you might hear something that really challenges you. The three of us all have really unique faith experiences. And you might hear something that, might get the wheels turning. How might this stretch you? Okay. And again, as you bring this into your faith practice, and then anything else that comes up, I really love like a dynamic, fluid conversation. And the last thing, so before we get started into our first panelist, I just wanted to share a reading. I've been reading this book, Live in Grace, Walk in Love by Bob Goff. And this, I thought the March 5th reading really fit with what we are looking at today. So it says, we make loving people a lot more complicated than Jesus did. So I think about that all the time. We make loving people a lot more complicated than Jesus did. We make loving people a lot more complicated than Jesus did. Jesus thought love meant a lot of things. It meant eating meals in people's homes, even when they were the kind of people who had been cut off by religious communities. Many of us in the queer community have felt that. We've been told we weren't allowed in a certain space because of who we love, or who we hang around with. It was touching the untouchable. It looked like making time for the people others pass by. Jesus wasn't scared away by those who had a reputation for being scandalous or unclean, because he saw through the labels that had been slapped on them, and he believed in who they might become. We'll miss the opportunity to see people grow if we won't meet them with love where they are. Sometimes it appears it's more important for us to be right than to be Jesus. No one has ever been argued into a change of heart. No one's ever been coerced into becoming more like Jesus. If you're hoping to spread the love of Jesus to those you think are wrong, try loving people like Jesus. So that's another challenge to sort of take away today, is sort of opening our hearts and loving like Jesus. And again, if you have a pad of paper near you or a notebook or something, and you want to bring some questions up for our panelists at the end, that would be great, because I think that's a good starting point. So Becca, Jake, or Kristen, who would like to go next? I don't want to choose for you. Where did Jake go? I didn't see him. Jake, are you ready?
And
Perfect.
Lauren, can I just ask, so if you do have questions and you know you don't have somewhere to write them, please put them in the chat, and know that we'll be monitoring the chat and we'll go back to them if you have a reflection there. So please feel free to use the chat. I know people have different comforts, or if you're calling in from a phone, sometimes it's hard to use the chat, but if you're able to and want to, please do that.
Perfect. Awesome. Jake, I'm gonna let you go.
Hi everyone, my name is Jake. I'm actually in Albany right now. I'm a current senior at UAlbany. I'm studying business and theater. So my faith journey has really been interesting. And I mean, as you know, faith, it says a journey, it's ever changing. So there's a lot that I've gone through and experienced. And so growing up, I was raised Roman Catholic. My whole entire family on both sides was Roman Catholic. So I went through all my sacraments and all of that, but then I never really found an interest, or I would always dread going to church with my family. But it wasn't really until 7th grade is when a lot of things started changing for me. In Rochester, I was introduced to this youth group, and I guess I never at the same time, I was really struggling with my sexuality. And I knew I was gay, but also what did that mean for me and my place in the church? But in this youth group, I found nothing but love. So that was really, really special for me. And I honestly, that took up a lot of my, like a majority of my time. I was always there doing things. And it truly saved me from a path that I could have seen myself going down. I was seventh, I was 13, 14, seventh and eighth grade. And, I was doing drugs. I was just not really in a good place. And like, as a young person, especially that young, that could have had a serious effect on me. And finding the acceptance in that youth group, while becoming an openly queer person, that was amazing for me. And during my time in that youth group, I did a lot of service. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Mary's Place refugee outreach. I did a ton of service there. I was there every single week, and on the weekends, and that's where I got a lot of my faith, and that's where I felt most connected with my faith, is through service. And unfortunately, during like ninth grade, like 2015, 2016, there was a big change in the leadership in my church. We got a new pastor who definitely had pretty opposite conservative views of the current pastor who just left. And he basically pushed my youth minister out, who's a very dear friend of mine, and I've learned so much from her. So that kind of tainted a lot of that, because it wasn't a place where I could really be accepted. I didn't feel safe. So, my time of going to church and, going to services in church kind of stopped there, but that didn't stop me from exploring my faith through service. Now, in college, I'm 22 now, so that was, that started 10 years ago. I am continuing my service. On campus, I am a huge advocate. I have opened, I go to SUNY Albany, like I said, and I opened up something called Harvey House. Harvey House is Albany's first LGBTQ plus living community. So it's in one dorm. We had about 46 students for our first semester open, and it's one of 3 in the SUNY system, and SUNY has 64 campuses. So that was something I'm really proud of. But like one of my favorite quotes by Harvey Milk, it's named after Harvey Milk. He was an alumni of UAlbany. He had a quote that says, "It's not my victory, it's yours and yours and yours." And I read that every single day, because truly, it wasn't just my victory, it was a victory for all my queer peers and the students that are going to come for years after me. And that really allowed me to get in touch with my purpose and my faith, because I feel close to God when I'm able to help people and do things for my community. As of Harvey House now, I'm working on making it more SUNY-wide. So I'm meeting with all the vice presidents of SUNY in May, and that's my goal. And then I eventually want to take it into a nonprofit and have houses throughout the country. So that's one of the big things that I really did, and that's something I am going to continue to do. And what was one of the questions? What does queering our faith mean to me? For me personally, like I said before, it's service and helping others. And what am I trying to say? I got lost. I get the same feeling of helping others or just trying to better my queer community. I get the same feeling through that as I did when I was in my youth group when I was younger. And that is really something that I reflect on a lot, because it brings me back to a really good place, and it brings me back to a place where I felt saved, and that was through the church. And as a queer person, it's often hard to, think about how you can feel saved in a church, especially in a Catholic church that I was in. but it is possible. And I think that's pretty amazing. My faith right now, I texted Lauren a few weeks ago and I was like, we need to talk because I've been struggling with it, if I'm being honest, just things I see in the news, things I read online, and even, the people I face while I'm doing my advocacy work that are, conservative in their religion. It's hard because I'm like, do I have a place? Do I not have a place? And where is that place? And I try to bring those feelings, but I also try to create places for people to be able to explore their faith. What else have I done about my faith? Lauren, I need you to bounce off of me. What is something?
Well, no, Jake has always been, so a little background, Jake was actually, when I was teaching at Victor, he was the student council president. And then we formed a friendship afterwards. And so Jake interned with me a little bit, and he actually, he would help me with youth group retreats because he had that brain and he had that, the wisdom to help make teens feel safe and comfortable. So it was exactly what we talked about is practices that, he would always make sure, like on the name tags, are you asking for teens to put their pronouns? And it was just little things that we can do that we can add into our lives that at first, someone asks, what are pronouns? Why are we doing this? But that little thing, that little practice that created that safe space. And again, like watching Jake's journey, it was always while he was living it, he was also, like he said, trying to create a feeling of safety for others to feel invited into their faith. And I learned so much from him from that. So, and we continue. Yeah.
Okay. Now I remember what I was going to say.
Okay.
I'm kind of like half of who I am. So we have also at my school, I am the assistant coordinator of my school's Gender and Sexuality Resource Center. So actually, I just got an email yesterday about we're doing another collaboration with Halal, which is our Jewish community on campus. And then we also did a collaboration with the Newman Catholic Association. So those are another ways, we can, or queering our faith, we held those programs and had these conversations in our space, and we kind of brought them in and they brought us into their space, and we were able to have a really great conversation. And then another way, in my faith journey, I am a drag queen. So that is a very big part of my life. I perform all throughout Albany, but something I've experienced, and that is having a chosen family. So as queer people, we're able to choose our family and choose who we want to be surrounded with. Because, with my work with Harvey House, I talked to a ton of students who, didn't feel safe going home, couldn't go home, which is another reason why I created that space. It's year-round housing. They can stay there during breaks, because, that's the last thing someone should have to worry about is going home, like not going home and not feeling safe. Like that's a place where you need to feel safe. But through drag, I have been able to, explore my faith. My drag family, we have family dinner every week. And some of us say a prayer, just that we're, thankful for that we have each other, because we know a lot of queer people don't have that. And that's another way I've really been able to connect with my faith and my advocacy. I do a lot of, advocacy with my drag and performance art. And all of it is just to show people that there's love out there and that you'll find your people. And it took me so long to, really find out who I am. And I did come out at a young age, and that definitely was not easy. But I'm at a point in my life where I have my family around me, my biological family, they're amazing. And my chosen family, they're the people I'm with every single day. And they restore my faith that, there's a God out there and he does love you. And he can come in many different forms. And that's something I always remind myself. And I'm still on this journey, and we'll see where it goes. I definitely, when I'm back in Rochester to meet my little nephew child, I'm gonna come to Spiritus because I really want to see all you and experience that, just because I've never experienced, you know, a place like Spiritus, and I really want to. So yeah, sorry, my words were kind of jumbled. I kind of forgot about like half the things I do. So
No, it's perfect. That was thank you so much for, and sometimes Jake performs here, so we can keep everyone updated on that. And he makes his own costumes. They're incredible. So awesome. Becca, do you want to go next, or Kristen?
Kristen, do you want to go next?
Oh no, you can go. Let's let everybody that's not from Spiritus go first.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really grateful that Lauren asked me to be a panelist tonight. My name is Becca Ferguson-Letts, and I am currently a student at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. I am on the path to ordination in the Presbyterian Church USA. And the Presbyterian Church USA is an open and affirming denomination. The Presbyterians of the United States basically had a schism in the early 80s. So it's not immediately evident always when you are driving down the street, but there are two different kinds of Presbyterian churches. There's Presbyterian Churches USA, and there's Presbyterian Church of America. So PCA and PCUSA. And PCA is not open and affirming, and PCUSA is open and affirming. But as part of the agreement in the schism, both were able to sort of keep the label of Presbyterian. So I just want to throw that out there because number one, it is very confusing. Number two, not all Presbyterians are open and affirming, very sadly to me. So it's something to sort of keep in mind. And I can give you examples of, you know, for example, I am a member and former staff member at Third Presbyterian Church, which is PCUSA. And, you know, we are proudly open and affirming, but down the street from us is another Presbyterian church that is not. So, you know, it's just something to sort of keep on your radar. I also bring this up because that schism was painful. As you know, it's painful to split. I don't need to tell you that, right? It's painful to split. And I also tell you this because the Methodist Church is facing the same dilemma. The United Methodists are in the same position, or I should say a similar position with regard to affirming gender and sexual identities. And so they are soon to be experiencing this same traumatic process. But I am on the path to ordination in the PCUSA, as I said. I am a former staff member at Third Presbyterian Church. I used to be the youth coordinator there. I am still a member. I'm under care of session there, and I am on the More Light Committee, which is our church's committee that handles issues of gender and LGBTQIA plus inclusion. Let's just say that. It's called the More Light Committee because back in the early 80s, when this first came up in a denominational forum, the conclusion was that there needed to be an extensive study done because there was yet more light to be shed on the matter. And so from there, the term more light became the sort of Presbyterian code for all things related to LGBTQIA inclusion. But then more light just took on a new meaning, right? So more light, what does that mean? Well, I choose to take it that more light means that there's more love, right? There's more light to love spread, more love to spread. So I think its original sort of historic meaning has morphed. And we call our little Facebook community more light, comma, more love at Third Church, because that's how we view it. I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which, for those of you who are familiar with that, is a Protestant denomination in the holiness tradition that is similar in many ways to Free Methodism and the Wesleyan Church. So it was sort of born out of the Azusa Street revivalist movement of the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. It is a more politically conservative and socially conservative denomination that really values, as the name would suggest, personal holiness, accountability. My dad was a pastor in that denomination, and my mother is still a very active member of the church in which I was born and raised. So Mike put in the chat to, can you address what queer means? And I'm glad he raised that, and I was planning on raising it anyway, because it is a funny term, and its meaning has morphed over time. Just as I said, the phraseology of more light and what it means in the Presbyterian context has sort of morphed over time. I think the label queer has morphed over time as well. It used to be very pejorative. I suppose some people could still use it in that context, but most people who use it nowadays use it as a way of reclaiming the narrative, and they use it to self-identify, and they do so confidently and positively. I identify as queer because I don't feel that I fit neatly into any of the normative categories around gender and sex. So let me break that down a little bit, what that means for me. I am straight-ish, but I have never been married. I don't really want to be married. I don't have kids, and I don't really want to have kids. For many years of my adult life, have identified as asexual, which means that I don't really have sexual yearnings, which is, I think, different than celibacy. Celibacy, I think, is an act of choice. It is a spiritual discipline, right? Celibacy is a I don't even know how to put it. It's a spiritual discipline, right? You've made a commitment, and as part of that commitment, your abstinence fits with your vow. Asexuality is different because it's a sort of general lack of interest in things sexual. So I would say that asexuality or gray sexuality probably is the best term to use, which just means that it's not that big a deal to me. It's not that important to me. I don't really care that much about it. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Both my own sexuality and others, I just don't care. And it's not like, oh, I don't care in an openness and political sense. It's like, I don't have the feelings that physiologically many other people do, right? But it's really hard to say what is normative, because what is normal, right? I think that many of the things that we have decided as a society are normative are in fact not. I think that far more people are queer than want to admit to themselves or others, because I think far more people have feelings or behaviors that don't fit into the standard box of straight man, straight woman, married woman. I just, we have a sense of, perhaps from movies, TV, books, elementary school, we acquire this notion of what relationships should look like and how people should behave in relationships. And I just don't think that actually most people really feel that way, if they were to be honest with themselves. I think a lot of people have to force themselves to fit into certain prescribed patterns. And I think that we are now entering an era in which we are starting to really dig deeply into figuring out what this all means. But I think that the reason I like to identify, the reason I like to sort of put myself out there as a member of the queer community is that I'm 42 years old and I still don't really know what I am. And it is not static either, right? So we all know that, like, as we age, we change. And we have all met people who, you know, like the late in life lesbian, we all have that friend, right? It's like you were married for 20 years and then all of a sudden now you have a new partner and it's someone of a, like, what? How'd that happen? It didn't just happen, right? It's like, it was always there. So I think, you know, in the same way that my own sexuality has not been static throughout my entire youth and adulthood, I don't think anyone's is really, but I also don't think that we are taught to interrogate that really. And I don't think that we are taught to be okay with that. And I don't know that there is actually yet enough scientific research to support a lot of the things. And I don't know that there's a lot of like psychological and therapeutic work yet done to really dig deeply into a lot of these things. I think that those paths of inquiry in academia are opening up, but I think there's still a lot to explore. And so thinking about queerness, I mean, to me, queerness is arguably one of the most central themes of the Christian faith. Because the entire Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, were written in contexts of oppression and struggle, poverty and marginalization. And that is very easy for us as North American middle class, nice white people for the most part to remember, because we have grown up in a very different context. And a lot of that part of the Bible has been filtered out for us over time. But it's really, really important, I think, for us all to remember that, you know, Jesus and his family lived under occupation, right? We don't really get that means. Mike put in the chat, it's very possible that Jesus is queer. Yeah, I think so too. There's a lot of speculation on this, right? Was Jesus married? Was he not? Right? Why is it that all men of his time got married? Why wasn't Jesus married? Right? Maybe he was and it's just not included. If it's not included in the biblical narrative there, that raises a different set of questions, right? Why is it not okay that Jesus could have been married? Why was his partner, wife excluded? But yeah, so and were his disciples also not? There's no mention of that. So there's just a lot of questions about who Jesus was. There's a lot of gaps in the information, but regardless, we know that Jesus he didn't fit normal patterns of like, he didn't follow normal sort of professional and personal trajectory in his life, right? And I don't think his disciples did either. And I think that once you think about our faith as the ultimate, like, how do I put this? So much of my faith is thinking about this difference between the periphery and the center, right? Who's at the periphery, who's at the center? Where's the power? Where's the distribution of resources? Where's the wealth? And we are constantly called to move to the periphery, right? In every way throughout the Bible, that is a recurring commandment, is to move to the edges. And Jesus was constantly doing that. There's so many examples I can pull from. But to me, that's what queering the faith means, is reminding ourselves of the fact that the context of the Bible is not the context in which we live. We have to reorient ourselves to the context that they experienced. And we have to reorient ourselves to the experience in which maybe we personally don't live, but the other people do. Right? Because I think once you queer the faith, you are able to better see the challenges that other people face. You're able to reach out to the periphery in a way that's more effective. And you're able to recenter yourself and your own faith, if all this makes any sense whatsoever. But I just want to close with this part. Queer means a lot of different things. And a lot of queer folks themselves actually get really upset if you use the term and you're not gay, lesbian, or transsexual, or something that fits into one of those labels. I mean, there's debate within the LGBTQIA community about what all these things mean. So there's no single right answer to any of this stuff. And a lot of people get offended if you identify yourself as queer without identifying yourself as someone who is you can't be queer if you are cisgender, meaning you can't be queer if you identify as the same gender with which you were born and that you fit sort of normal female roles, right? A lot of people say, oh, that you can't, that doesn't count, right? I say everything counts, you do you. Also, a lot of people say, if you expand the notion of queer too big, it becomes meaningless. There's an argument to be made there, right? Queer does mean something, and you can't just say it means someone who's peculiar, because we all know people who are peculiar, right? It's not being peculiar. There's something, it's being sexually peculiar, right? Or gender peculiar. But I just, I want to close with this, Matthew, in his genealogy of Jesus, included several women who had really unusual sexual circumstances. Tamar was raped violently in her own family. Rahab, who arguably worked as a professional prostitute. Bathsheba, used as a sexual pawn. All those women who came from really unusual sexual circumstances were part of Jesus's genealogy, right? So the fact is that it was remarkable that they were included in the genealogy, but it's even more remarkable that these weren't and Ruth, I forgot Ruth, the foreigner, right? So it's remarkable that they were included at all, but it's also really remarkable that they were not normative in terms of following what was for their time, traditional roles of what women should be and do, right? And as a survivor of childhood sexual assault, which plays into my own identity as queerness in a very strange and complicated way that I won't get into, but as a survivor of abuse, that is very comforting to me, to think that women who have had unusual sexual circumstances still fit into the master plan. I'll leave it, because I could go on and on and on and on for but we only got till 8:30, so I'll stop here. So Kristen, you take it away.
Oh my goodness. Don't know how I'm going to follow that, but we will try. We will try. Hi, everybody. I am Kristen. Pronouns I use are she, they. I get to Spiritus through a connection. That is Mike Boucher. That is actually how I get to Spiritus. initially. And I've been here as the young adult minister since 2020. And who am I and how did I get here? Well, I'm from Rochester, and I am the daughter of a preacher who ministry has now taken him out to Arizona. But for my lifetime and my mother's lifetime, we went to church on Hudson Avenue. And my grandmother also went to that church. That church is of the Church of Christ non-denominational belief system. We don't have like a creed. There's no like governing body. They're pretty autonomous congregations across the world, linked mainly by a very archaic biblical belief, in that they only use the Bible as their practice book or what they use. And so that is how I was brought up in that space. But immediately, or not immediately, but by the time I was like 10, it was problems. Not just in identity, but also in just being a woman. Like, women don't have speaking roles at the church at all. There are no women in leadership. There are no women ushers. Like, literally, you come sit in the pews and you go home, or you go to the kitchen and cook. And so that for me was a no. And I really thank my parents for talking to me about what you have to question. Test everything is one of those things, one of those verses that, was a regular occurrence. Like, test everything. And in testing what I was being brought up in, it didn't work for me. And so a part of that is, but I still did some stuff. I did Sunday school because you could do that. And I would, help with the kids or something like that. But that's not all that I have inside of me. And that is all, not all what I'm going to contribute into the world. And so I had left all church fellowship for a while. And it wasn't until coming back to Rochester and being at Spiritus is the first time that I've been at a place where it feels super inclusive, where it's not just men talking, it's not just women talking. It is a place that really is for all. And that is my experience here at Spiritus. And the other part, I think, because I come from a non-denominational background, I really like float through religious spaces and like try to find my place in them. And I want to thank Alice Walker and bring her into the conversation, because womanist theology, and I'll leave some of these links in the chat here, really is a place where I find myself and find affirmation and hope for a bright future, more light, as you were talking about, Becca. I really like that. If you're friends with me on Facebook, you know that I just was reading a book called Hallelujah Anyhow, and I swear that I have found myself an ancestor and a legacy that I can hold on to. Whereas, like, before reading this book just this week, if I could name 5 Black women, straight, queer, questioning, or whatever, that were bishops or in leadership roles, I struggle with that. And those are the intersections that I approach the space of queering our faith in, because I just don't show up as a woman, femme-bodied person. I don't just show up as queer. I don't just show up, as somebody that's silent. Like, I am a ball of energy and I have a lot to contribute. And so in finding myself, it is about queering faith. It's about saying that I have beliefs that sustain and hold me through. And I also question belief systems that ignore or quiet or try to silence Black women in particular. And this is coming from a Black church experience up until being here at Spiritus. It's like, how do we create a safe space while also leaving room for God to work? And I think a part of that is closing the book itself. And that's a part of my queering the faith. It's like, yes, I have the Bible and I use it, but there are also other sacred texts that I really hold dear to my heart that, again, hold and sustain me through my work. I don't know if I answered all the questions, but I'm really excited to continue this conversation. Queer to me is a literal thinking outside of the box, or really saying that the box doesn't exist. I really like how we already started questioning what normal is. When you're moving through the world, that wants to silence you for merely existing, right? You have to question literally everything. And so it started with gender. And that's where I was noticing, like, wait a minute. Now, come on now. Y'all can't tell me this makes sense, where my mom could be a teacher, but she could never like be in leadership in a place, right? Or I could be a biblical scholar, but there wouldn't necessarily be a path for me to explore those gifts or cultivate those gifts even in that space. And so, yeah, we just had to turn it upside down, you know, really close the book again on some things and really leave space for God to work. And that is my life. Is I am a reflection of God working, a reflection of unpacking a lot of our societal norms that I inherited in coming into this world. I believe that Jesus definitely left the path for us in a clear example, you know, like he was turning tables over. And so when I think about how radical Jesus is, I'm like, come on. That makes me excited. And that also like keeps me going in this work and have these conversations, not just with these spaces, but I'm having more conversations about faith and faith communities because as Jake was saying, kinship is part of the queer identity because so many folks are shunned from their biological families due to all of the isms that hold us down. And so in kinship, another part of what brings me to this space is my organization, Flower City Noir Collective. And Jake, you had started talking about houses, and then I got so excited because that is part of the work I do also, because housing for queer folks is an issue, okay? Homeless queer folks, especially homeless youth, like that's where I see a lot of folks come through my doors, or the calls that I receive is like, there are teenagers being put out of their house. There are teenagers that are, especially during quarantine or 2020, 2021, that were literally left with no resources, nowhere to go, spaces that didn't have the information to help them in a safe way without re-traumatizing them. So the need for queer housing is there. We got to just check that box off and just be honest and upfront with what that is. And that comes with archaic beliefs, you know, like static beliefs. And so the other part I really like is fluidity of spirit and identity, that like we really could be who we want to be, and that person may change for tomorrow. You know, my ideas today are not and may not reflect the person I am later on tonight, you know, but we all have those spaces, like, and I just try to stay stretchy and curious with myself, especially when it comes to like belief systems and faith communities and things like that, because a whole lot of damage is what we inherited when we got here, all of us. And so to unpack generations of that is tiring, you know what I'm saying? And the effects are no less harmful to my contemporaries and the folks that came before me. So yeah, let's keep going. If you have any more questions, you know, I'm free to answer them. But I'd love to keep like the talk going with the other folks too.
So can you repeat that one phrase? I love it. You said like close the book and leave space for, what did you say? Close the book and leave space for God to work.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And I think the recognition of there's other sacred texts, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's so many, I mean, I think Becca, you could chime in too, some of the things that texts that we were introduced to in seminary, you know, just again, opened your eyes to think about, you know, our faith in different ways. A lot of times, you know, Kristen is constantly posting about new books that I think really challenge the norm and challenge our thinking. Reverend Seeley's passed down some of those books to me as well. So that I love that, looking at those other sacred texts. Jake, did you want to pop on about what go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, since everyone, the two other panelists touched on it and the word queer. So I do a lot of like sexual health and queer education through Albany, but on campus. And this is always something that comes up. And it's very interesting. So someone in the chat said, you know, how it was a derogatory and hurtful term. And like Becca said, you know, taking back that power. That is one of the many reasons why a lot of LGBTQ plus people do use that term. But I think it's important to look at where that word kind of comes from and what it really means. So the word queer actually comes from a German word that I cannot pronounce. But that word basically means oblique or perverse. So it kind of means acting in a way that's not like widely accepted or kind of opposite. So we live in a heteronormative society, and if you don't know what heteronormative means, basically it's we see the world through a straight lens, like males should be with females, and then we have our strict gender roles. Another reason a lot of people use the word queer is when it comes to gender and sex. So I mean, right now there are at least 6 identified different combinations of XY chromosomes. So it isn't just XY or XX. That's just not true. And you have to look at it as there are so many different identities and so many different genders that you can't really put that all into one box or into one word. And that's why we use the word queer nowadays, because its goal is, or at least in my opinion, is to encompass everyone. I will say I'm gay, but I'll also say I'm queer. A lot of reasons, if you look in my name, I have my pronouns as he, they. And a lot of that has to come with my gender identity, because you have gender on a spectrum, male and female, but there's infinite amount of combinations in between. If this is male and this is female, I would say I fall somewhere there, just because I don't feel like I should conform or like I do belong on one side. Some would call that non-binary. And that truly just has to do with, my gender expression and gender identity, which are 2 different things. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about the word queer and basically where that derives from and how people can understand it. Because, even my parents, when I would say the word queer, they were born in the 60s. So that was, very much, not a word that you would use. So, I continue to educate them, and I'm happy to do it because they're very understanding. So yeah, that's another way, I think when we say queering our faith, we're not, necessarily talking about just the inclusion of different sexualities and genders, but it's looking at faith in a different aspect or an opposite aspect of how we see it in our world today. And that's something that I, think is really important, because it can have a lot of meanings, but, try to go against, quote unquote, the norm, but try to open up your eyes and try to see it from a different angle, because you'll be able to, explore so much more in your faith and your journey with faith.
Yeah, to jump onto that as well, I think I probably wouldn't use the term queer folks if I wasn't one of the queer folks, because you know how it is, right? It's just easier when it's the the first person plural. And the language that I like best when dealing with these issues is to say, like, Lauren identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community, because I'm not saying like Lauren is a lesbian, right? Because then it's like, well, what is a lesbian? Lauren is, well, I know lots of different lesbians and they're not, right? Sorry to put your business out there. If you didn't already know Lauren was a lesbian, she is. Okay, there we go. But you know what I mean? Like, and also it makes it clear that like, it's the person who identifies themselves, right? So if you get to decide who you are and what you are, right? So if you know, she identifies as gender nonconforming, she identifies as gender nonconforming, and that's the language I use. I try not to say like she is gender nonconforming, because I don't like the idea of, I don't know, that sounds different to me, right? Because it needs to be her, her claiming the label or claiming the language. And yeah, so if that's helpful at all, that's just what I use when I'm in a situation where it comes up and it matters and it needs to be said, which I would argue it needs to be talked about a whole lot less than people think it does. But if it does need to be brought up, I just like very frankly say like, you know, he identifies as non-binary, and leave it at that. But I don't know, everyone has different feelings about language. Language is tricky. It's just like with race. All the labels that we have are inadequate in some way or another, you know, so.
Like, yeah, I definitely agree with you, because, you know, I know someone that identifies as queer, but doesn't, you know, and only dates men, but doesn't identify as gay. And then I know people that identify as gay and they don't identify as queer. So, I mean, obviously you're not going to encompass a whole community of people and call them all queer, because that might not be how they identify. So I think that's really important to mention for sure.
And I think for me in this talk about naming, I'm just going to bring it back to womanism. So the book is called In Search of Our Mother's Garden, and it's by Alice Walker. And she says, feminism is to womanism as purple is to lavender. So like, if you think of a color wheel, you know what I'm saying? Like they next to each other, like they around each other. But there's something very distinctive about womanism, and that is about naming yourself. And that goes into, I would say, queering faith, and also like, for the purpose of this conversation, like queering is just like looking at it in a different way, like just unpacking what you came in the world being taught and just putting it up against another belief. And so that part about naming oneself goes into queer identity, because you name yourself for yourself and you identify in those ways. And that is the beauty of us holistically as humans, right, is that we have language that is fluid and that changes, but we can use it for positiveness, for goodness, if we so choose. We just find in our history books that language is more of a divisive agent and less of a uniting agent. And in our current context, I think that we just have more work to do on unpacking our language generally, so that we can allow free thought or more free thought, but also allow for more connections with other folks who sometimes those language barriers or those vocabulary barriers is all that is. Like even this word about queer, if I talk to old lesbians, they don't like queer. Like, do not say queer because it's disrespectful for their time and for how they were brought up. But then if I talk to kids younger than me, they, you know, they're using language that I don't even have a grasp on yet, because it's still moving and shaking, because we are still here breathing on earth. And so things are still moving and shaking, like, period. And so I don't know what we're talking about, but yes, that naming yourself. And again, books by Black women is where I find myself. It's where I have found myself in this religious space. It's where I found myself in a literary sense. It's just where my center is. And so I have a bookstore called Noir Reading Room. And so in that bookstore, book club, we read and wrestle with these texts. Less of a religious intersection there. But I'm sure that group is going to emerge, especially after this conversation, about what other texts can we read? What can we do to challenge what we already know and unpack some of those things so that we can be in more community with our neighbors around us?
Can I say something quickly about what they were just talking about? So you were talking about like naming and language, and I just wanted to share an experience, basically something that I kind of like researched, kind of like dug into when, you know, I was looking basically at society through a queer lens, is a lot of times how we address people. And I think it's really interesting. this is another weird way we can kind of like queer our faith and think about our language, is honorifics. If people don't know what an honorific is, it's basically like Mrs., Miss, Mr. And I always like looking at like where words derive from. But does anyone know what like Mr. is short for? Anyone? So Mr. is actually short for master in the English language. And then, you know, someone would be, you know, a Mrs. is short for mistress, but also you're only a Mrs. if you are married to, a lot of people will use that if you're married, and oftentimes in our heteronormative world, it's a man and a woman, they're married to the Mr., who is the master. So it's really important to see how we're categorizing these people through a very patriarchal way. And then you have like Miss, MS, or like Miss again. You know, they're not married and they're not connected to the man. So that's another way I try to look at a lot of things in the world, is how we're using those terms and just how embedded a lot of that can be in our society. And I just wanted to share that because I think it's something really interesting to think about, and how we think about gender, especially gender roles in our faith, because that's a really big thing as well. So yeah, I just wanted to put that into everyone's mind. It's really interesting if you look it up. But yeah.
Thanks for
Jake,
sharing.
that brings me to this memory. Those of you who read the vlog tomorrow, no spoilers, okay? No spoilers. But I'm remembering church as a child, right? And so one of those like big gender things that came up, I had a blog back then, which I took all of my like religious blogs down when I was anti-church or whatever, but maybe it's time to put them back up and just to compare where I am right now and what I was talking about then. But I go to a birthday party at these folks' house, and all the boys go in the other room like to watch football. And I'm like, y'all playing, because this is not how it's in my house. In my house, like my dad is cooking. Like I had seen and experienced a way of gender that was different than the status quo. So I get to this place, and so all the boys go, and I'm like, well, what's going on? They're like, oh, boys don't have babies and boys don't do dishes. And I said, oh no, get me out of here. Get me out of here, because if this is what we are passing on to the next generation, we're doing damage that is irreversible, right? Like we are doing so much damage to the folks coming after us just based on these archaic ideas and thoughts that like perpetuate violence. And then when I speak from it from an intersectional lens, like to think of Zora Neale Hurston saying that Black women are the mule of the world, and then to have those same folks saying that women are still going to be here cleaning up and we're still going to enforce and hold up these like gender norms or whatever, is another place where it's like, how do we queer our faith? How do we really, if people are having gender reveals now, right? How do I have a conversation about queer faith and what that means and what that looks like when we are forcing, and I mean by forcing, we are talking about babies' reproductive organs before they hit this side of the earth, right? And saying we're going to queer our faith. Like, how are we queering our faith, and how are we setting that example for them if they're coming into a world we've already checked the box for them? We've already built the box, checked the box, named them inside that box, decorated the nursery inside that box, signed them up for sports, and it doesn't start or end at gender reveals, right? It continues to go. I wanted to play football in high school and I couldn't. Why? You're a girl. And I'm like, what does that mean? What does being a girl mean that I cannot play a game that's literally a ball being thrown across the thing? Like, what have we not? Our technology is moving, right? We have tablets now, we have cell phones, we have the internet. We didn't have the internet before, now we do. And thinking about all of these changes that have happened, and how stuck we are in some places just brings me extreme sadness sometimes. Like, oh man, it's an iPhone 45. And we're still trying to figure out how to divest from some of the ideas that are oppressive, violent, harmful, not just for the folks that are putting out, the folks that are receiving it, and for the folks in the future. The implications are large, are very big about how we, the folks on this call, the folks that we know, how do we continue this conversation when there are so many layers, right? We could spend 5 hours just talking about language and not even hit the tip of the iceberg for what tomorrow's language conversation is going to be. And so all of that to say, the work is enormous, right? And it's so many places, but what I like to encourage folks to do is like find out where you are and start thinking about it from that point. Becca, when you were talking about moving from the center out, it's like, what does that look like in queer in our faith conversation? For me, even being at Spiritus is queering of my faith, in that it's an experience that is so different than anything I've ever experienced before. And it's hard to put into words unless you have been there yourself, right? Unless you have heard Audre Lorde's name being said during Eucharist time. Like, what? Like, this gift that I have here at Spiritus is wonderful. And I wish more folks could have it, but I'm glad that we are doing some of our work and continuing to like shake the table, build the table longer, bring more chairs, leave accessible spaces, make sure we have childcare, really, really unpack all of these things so that we can truly move into queering what faith is and what it looks like in practice.
And this is really prevalent in our youth as well, as Kristen knows. And, at Spiritus, we've created that space for our youth. And these are conversations that they're having as well. I do the 7th and 8th grade youth group, and Mark Potter does the 9 through 12. And this is very real for them in the world that they're growing up in. And I think having Audre Lorde's name brought up at Eucharist and the way in which the language we choose in our Mass makes such a difference. And again, when we think about, as a community, how that creates that safe space and invites others is huge. And the goal is to bring that to other places as well. With a little time, we have 15 minutes left here. The conversations have been so incredible. And I just would love to open it up for others to ask questions for our panelists, to talk. I know the chat's been moving the entire time. Your own, comments, thoughts. If I would invite anyone to share now who would like to share.
I guess I would, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying if anyone has any questions too.
I'm just going to direct this to Kristen, but it's relevant for everybody else who can find some useful meaning out of it. But Kristen, I have so many books for you, my dear. It breaks my heart to hear you say that you have to close the Bible. And what I would instead ask you to do is to open it and to revisit the sources that you are using to help you read and to interpret it. There is so much strength and joy to be found in the midst of it. But I will say that I too had to learn how to read it. And I was very, very fortunate to have a Black womanist biblical scholar teach me how to do that. And I took a course of hers called African American Biblical Hermeneutics. And that essentially means how to read a book through the lens of the enslaved rather than the slaver, right? So you've got some great Black women theologians. I put 2 of them in the chat One is Diana Hayes, one is Shawn Copeland. I think that if you have not heard of Shawn Copeland, if you have not read Shawn Copeland, that Shawn Copeland would make you stand up and jump for joy. My books are here on the shelf. I'm more than happy to lend my books to you. And I'm certainly more than happy to just, send you links to articles. And I would say the same thing to everybody. Please, please, please don't close your Bibles because somebody didn't properly teach you how to engage with it. And aside from Black women, I would suggest that you find a copy of Phyllis Tribble's Texts of Terror, which also spins biblical interpretation on its head and centers women as opposed to this patriarchal understanding that we have of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I think that that's important for people of every stripe, race, gender, how you identify your personhood. And that's all I will say. I will see you in church at some point on some Sunday, and we'll probably hand you my telephone number and or my email address so that I can open up a pipeline and begin to feed you.
Oh, thank you so much for your words. We don't have to wait till you come to church. I would just send you a direct message right now with the email and phone number so that we can continue the conversation. Thanks so much. And just to clarify, like, I have one Bible. It's the same Bible that I've had like my whole life. I bought it for myself for Easter in like 2008. And it's the same New King James Bible that I've had. And so by closing it, I mean, I had to close my former self looking at that book. Right. Yeah. So I had to be like, no, Lot's wife turning into salt. That's a different way to look at it. Right. Or liberation theology and how it informs how I interpret the stories is more, I think, of what I'm saying. And also I do leave more room for other sacred texts to influence my work. So thank you so much. And I'll just send you a message right now.
Perfect. Perfect.
Hey, Meredith, you want to go?
Maybe, yeah. I hope I'm not on mute.
Nope, you're not.
Okay. I guess I've been thinking about how the ways in which we can think about queering our faith as something that even your sort of white bread heterosexual people could use as a metaphor for what God calls us to. Personally, I developed my adult faith as a result of starting a relationship with a woman. And that was really challenging to me, that I had to really question everything, and I had to question what God wanted me to do. And what it really felt like was God was calling me to be my full self and not to just follow the path that I was expected to follow. And so I guess you could say that God helped me come out. But I think that that's one thing that queer people have in common, is that they actually have to be conscious of their choices. They don't just follow a path because it's what the path is that everyone follows. And they have to really think, what is my gender? What is my gender expression? Who am I attracted to? How do I want to make this work in the world? Do I want to have children? Do I not want to have children? And I think when you think back to the original church, Jesus was calling his followers to be, to step out of the mainstream, to refuse to just go along with what they were expected to do, and to really question everything, and to question it through the lens of love and what will lead to more love. So I would encourage everyone to just use that lens, the lens of queerness.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
Anyone else feeling moved to just comment or speak, or something that just bubbled up while we were talking? We have such a great group of people here.
I just, this is Steve. I just want to ask, with Kristen, you were talking about reveal parties and everything, and now with bills such as the Don't Say Gay bill, you can't even reveal or question or talk about sexuality in school. I mean, they say through third grade, but really goes on and on. How does that whole thing, and that's not just Florida, it's throughout the country. How does that affect this whole discussion if you're being pushed down from a governmental standpoint as well? It's a tough.
Think about our youth too, like bringing the kids into a world like my child's gonna have two moms. We purposely didn't do a gender reveal because that reason exactly. We weren't, we didn't, just wasn't in what we wanted to do. But I think about if you're around kids, they don't care, right?
Yeah.
Like I have 7 nephews. They were at my wedding. None of them cared about the fact that I was marrying their aunt. And I think that that's something that we as adults sometimes tend to put a lot on, and people who are making those decisions, but kids really don't care that much, and they're curious and they ask questions. But they, the way I think as adults in their lives, a lot of the time, like we can control that sort of narrative by, being open and not crushing them with, this is what it should look like. Jake, did you want to add something to that? Yeah.
Yeah. I find it really interesting because I remember the first time I remember like meeting a gay person for the first time, and like realizing that, there wasn't just straight people out there. He was my art teacher. His name was Jason. I'm friends with him now. We still talk, but like that was, I think, in 5th grade, and then I had him. He was a substitute for me then, and then I had him again in 7th grade. But the Don't Say Gay bill, they're talking about not talking about sexuality, until they can't talk about sexuality until 3rd grade. But even when I think about it now, like in New York State, and one of the most progressive states, I was never taught about that in general, like at all. So I think it's really interesting. Like, there are a lot of, like, there is no queer education in school. And I do a lot of sexual health education, and I focus on HIV and AIDS. And you'd be like so surprised how many people my age, I'm 22 now, they just don't know. And I think it's really interesting that they put that bill in place. And now in other states, more liberal states, we still don't even get that education. So I think right now is a time for states other than Florida to, think about their curriculum. I don't know if it's changed at all since I've been in grade school, but I never got any of that education. So I think this is a time where states need to look at their career education in grade school.
Yeah, one of an article that I read from a woman who was married to a woman and had 2 children. Her point, and she was a conservative, her point was that even in kindergarten, in 1st grade, when people are drawing pictures of their family, and they draw a picture of 2 moms or 2 dads, or 1 mom or 1 dad, or you can't, it's the teachers become even concerned about talking about that. It's not talking about sex education, or gender or anything. It's just talking about families. And
Right.
It kind of puts a whole damper on what is a family. What is a family? I mean, it's anything.
Yeah,
I'm
because
gonna
I
bring,
didn't know
yeah.
what people were until I was probably in 6th or 7th grade when I was having my own feelings. So, you know, it's a really
I'm
good
gonna
point.
bring in my wife too. She's actually a principal at an elementary school. And so she's gonna add to what you were saying, Steve. Here, I'll move on.
Hi, everybody.
Hey,
No, I'm listening. I made her take out her AirPods because I wanted to listen in on the great conversations. But I heard you talk about, like educating and health education. And we recently just brought health back to our elementary schools. And it was wild how many parents contacted us right away when the letter went out, wondering what health means and if we'd be talking about sexuality and, similar. It was almost like an assessment letter went out, like they wanted to opt their kids out of it. And I'll never forget being in, at the time, my principal's office, and he's so protective of me. So right away he was like aggressive, like, well, what do you mean by that? And it was so funny to hear him, like your stereotypical, like Italian white male
White guy.
principal, if you were to think, for him to get so, not aggressive, but get so protective about it. And I just see it all the time, it's starting younger and younger. You have kindergartners, you have first graders who, boys painting their nails and wanting to play with the girls and just not sure. So I think it helps that, I, am married to a woman and I'm comfortable in that. And my staff supports me in that. And that's always super helpful too. But it's important to know, I didn't really realize, my true self until I was in college. And then when I met Lauren and decided that I wanted to be with a woman. But, to see 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds know who they are and, have either parents, grandparents, aunt, uncles who don't understand them or teachers who don't understand them. Sorry, now I'm just going on a tangent, but I definitely see it every day and it's real and it's happening younger and younger. So I heard you talk about education. I'm like, yep, it is still happening at the elementary level. So yeah, that's my little 2 cents there. Thanks for having me.
thank you.
And she's folding onesies right now. So
And another book that just before we leave, it's called it's being used actually in support of these bills that are happening because it's a banned book. It's called All Boys Aren't Blue. And what it does, I would encourage folks to read it. It's a young adult book coming of age. But that person, I can't remember his first name right now. John? George. I think his name is George. So George is going over and telling his story, right? And so if you're in education spaces or interact with other kids or whatever like that, right? Like, that some kid, like everybody is different, right? And certain personalities like present themselves like more prominent very early. But in the book, he talks about effeminate behavior. Like, this is his language that he uses, and how people would just beat him up for being more feminine than the manly man, right? And so what it was doing, right? I was on a flight from Arizona back over here, and I was with my nephew, and I'm looking at my nephew like, am I reading this book and looking at my nephew and putting these two things together? And like, I've been in the room on a FaceTime with him where people have like literally just called him gay or like started bullying him because of just his mannerisms and how he moves through the world. And it's like, y'all, I don't want to have to fight y'all about my nephew. And also we have to do this unlearning so that the kids aren't replicating these oppressive behaviors and things like that, because it affects them. And it continue, like, we have to unpack and unlearn these things in queering our faith, but in just in queering our worldview, really, in queering and questioning really how we get to this space and how we show up. That's all I got. I love y'all.
Hey, thank you so much. Oh my gosh. I think Mike's gonna close us out here, but Becca, Jake, Kristen, thank you so much.
Before we close out,
Yeah.
I apologize. There's and I don't know if folks are familiar with Brian Massengel, Father Brian Massengel. But he's doing some interesting work at Fordham University. Father Massengel, Brian Massengel, is gay. And he's become more outspoken about it. And I know him personally, have actually taken some classes with him. But it looks like he is actually where did I just find it? He is now teaching a class on homosexuality and Christian ethics using biblical text to challenge church teachings on same-sex relations. So, and Brian Massengel has always been a person to, if somebody draws a line, he'll walk across it. So I would also just kind of keep an eye on the work that he's doing. And he's a prolific writer. So I think that in terms of bringing the LGBTQ into centering the language around the LGBTQ community, Brian Massengel is one of the few priests, Black and gay, who is working from the inside. And, it's got to be tough. So any support that, you can give to him, and any support that you can find in his work, I think is mutually beneficial to the entire church as well. So I just wanted to share that before you close out.
Thank you. And I was looking them up as you were speaking. There's a lot of YouTube links for that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I have two quick things that are desperately dying to get out of my mouth before we go. Number one, we are in the season of Lent. And I keep thinking about this question you raised about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida and Utah and Nevada and other places, right? And it's always struck me as deeply ironic that Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, are just so deeply uncomfortable with sexuality, because ours is an incarnational faith. It is a faith of the flesh. The flesh is super important in our faith tradition. The fact that Jesus came in the flesh as a body, he existed as a body, his whole body ascended to heaven when he died, right? Like there's just all this stuff about bodies that sits at the core of what Christianity is. And yet we are really, really deeply uncomfortable with talking about the bodies, our own bodies, other people's bodies. And so it always strikes me as deeply ironic that, and of course, what the people in Florida may not realize is this is going to backfire horribly. So, whatever, do what you want, but it's not going to work. So it's hard for me to put a ton of stock in this because I just don't see it actually happening, right? I just think they're going to look silly in the end. But the reality is that we all have to do a lot of work to think about what our bodies can, should, do, be, are meant to be, etc. right? And especially when we're in Lent, I think it's that much more powerful. The last thing I want to say is I love that your congregation, like my congregation, is really trying very hard to do as much learning as it can. But I do think there's a limit to it. And here's where I think the limit lies. We think that if we learn enough, we'll get it. And then once we get it, we can be better allies and we can help advocate and we can fight for justice for those people. But the reality is we're never going to get it. And we're not called to get it, right? So people will say to me all the time, I just don't get this non-binary thing. That's fine. You don't have to get it.
Right.
No one asked you to get it, right? This is not about getting it. You are called to love. And in fact, I would argue you are called to love despite not getting it. When someone says they have multiple sclerosis, I don't debate with them about what that means or how that feels. I'm never going to know, because if I don't have that diagnosis myself, it just doesn't resonate with me. I can understand when someone said oh, I have this kind of pain and so forth, but really, no, I don't know what that means. When someone says you get my point, right? With other things, we don't really ever know what it's like. I am never going to know what it's like to be a Black woman. Never. I will try very, very, very hard to empathize, but I can educate myself to a point. But if I'm using education as my only mechanism to access empathy, it is never going to work, right? And that's where the spiritual piece comes in. And that's where I think we, as a community of believers, have a real obligation to fill the gaps in what our education cannot provide for us, right? Because we're never going to know enough. We're never going to be able to study our way out of this. It helps a lot, but there's a point to which our love is going to have to sustain us. And, you know, if someone says I'm such and such sexual and you have zero idea what it is, that's fine. It's okay. Because it doesn't matter, because you're not called to know what all the things mean, right? You are called to love. Now, of course, this sounds so cliched. And in reality, this is really, 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 really hard. But again, we're in the season of Lent. And this is the thing that keeps coming back to me. And this is also the point where my church is at now too, and so I'm glad that people confide in me and they say like, oh, I don't get this. But now I get a little sassy about it and I say, that's fine. You don't have to get it. Just be quiet and do the good work God has called you to do. Right? Because, and I think that's true for disability advocacy, racial advocacy, et cetera, right? Anyway, I'm now stepping down off the soapbox. But I just felt like I had to say that. So I mourn deeply about what's happening in Florida, but I think it's gonna just fail so miserably that it's so hard for me to take it really seriously, because it's just so ridiculous. It just can't work. And I think that there's gonna be like 1,000,001 unintended consequences. So, but that's another topic for another day, so.
And that's why I always wanted to be your partner in school. It's seminary. Mike, did you want to close us with a prayer here? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say deep, deep gratitude to Becca, Kristen, Jake, and Lauren for really giving us so much more than I didn't know where this was going to go tonight. Like the spirit was moving from as soon as we signed on. Also grateful to all of you for participating. I want to link as well. I appreciate Courtney being on tonight. Courtney in February did something on Black Catholic history, and in some ways tonight I feel like we got queer Christian history, and it's not that it belongs to anyone. This is our history. This is our tradition. This is our faith. And this is something I just really appreciated Jake saying, quoting Harvey Milk, it's not my victory, it's yours and yours and yours. And my hope is that that we are all able to pursue freedom as hard as so many of the marginalized and outside groups have had to. That we pursue our own liberation and the liberation of all with such vigor that, maybe going to Becca's phrase, that people will say, see how they love one another. Mm-hmm. That it'll be so obvious because people are so free to be who they are, who God has called them to be as both individuals and a community. But I have such deep gratitude for everyone who's part of it. I'm getting a little distracted here. I got to save the chat again to make sure everything is in the chat. Thank you all for all that you're putting in there. And so if we can just, I know thanks for hanging in. I know some people had to sign off. We're a little over time and it is so worth it. And really hoping we can revisit this at some later time. This would be like an amazing Saturday weekend presentation. Like this would, just getting a lot of people in the retreat. Yes.
Yep.
What we're doing for Pride Month.
Yeah.
All right. The plans are already in action motion.
I don't think I need to say any more, so people are already organizing, so we'll go with that. But yeah, thank you. If we just close our eyes, if you feel comfortable. And as you breathe in, just take in everything that this conversation invites us into. It invites us to be in our bodies. It invites us to be in our spirit. It invites us to be in a sense of freedom and turning tables and welcoming, challenging, affirming. It invites us to be in questioning. It invites us to defy easy answers. It invites us to be in spaces that are not easily quantifiable. It invites us to not trying to always understand and love anyway. It invites us into joy. It invites us into discovery. It invites us into courage. And it invites us into each other's arms. And so as we leave tonight, we lock arms, we lock hands, we hold each other up, and we make sure that as is said at wedding vows, that what God has brought together, let nothing separate. And so may we not be separated in our commitment to let what emerged tonight continue to emerge in our midst, in our lives, in our churches, in our homes, in our schools, and everywhere we go. Amen.
Yeah.
So this, thank you again for